assume mostly technologists, but I'm not going to primarily talk about technology here today. I'm rather going to talk about what I see the impact of technology on society. And as technologists, I think it behooves us to think a little bit about where things are headed and make sure that they head where we want them. I think we're in a big transition right now, and there's a lot of policy that's going to be worked out in the next few years that we'll be living with for the next century. We need to pay attention and not let it just happen, not be too reactive, but rather be proactive and think a little bit. So I want to address some of these issues. I'm going to talk about them from the perspective of the big data ecosystem, but I think the same sort of thoughts are relevant to other areas. So next slide, please. So I had the good fortune of being a founder of the Hadoop project, which really is a confluence of a lot of things have led to Hadoop success. The abundance of cheap hardware that we're seeing and can continue to see the drop in price of just about every component, processing, storage, networking, has let us afford to save more data and process it, as well as allow technology to proliferate through just about every industry. So we're entering a world where everything is a high-tech industry that's generating data. And then we've got another strong trend in open source, Apache open source, which I know best, which commoditizes technology, software. So you've got affordable hardware, affordable software. You've got data that's relevant to just about every element of our business. And you put all these trends together, and it just takes the right seed to get things started. And we see the emergence of an open source platform that really harnesses data and lets us begin to build this new world of technology, which is it's a lot of wonderful possibilities. We're going to talk about some of those, and we want to make sure that we get those possibilities. Can I get the next slide, please? We're really seeing the emergence of a new standard platform built around Hadoop and open source, where we've got this kernel in a distributed file system and a scheduler and a host of tools. Most of them, the vast majority of them, Apache open source projects, from Pig and Hive and HBase through newer things like Spark and Storm and so on, Giraffe, a wide variety of tools that enables this new style of computing, where you can amass disparate kinds of data in a single store, have a variety of tools that you can explore the data, try out different methods, and build new applications, revise existing applications with a lot more agility than people had before, and at much lower cost. We had a customer recently who deployed a Hadoop solution replacing a proprietary solution, and the cost was 1,000 times less per byte. And their performance was greatly improved. So it's a phenomenally different platform that is really taking off like wildfire. So we need to think about where this is going, and what is all this data that's being collected? How's it being used? And are these things we always want to see happening? So next slide, please. So I think we're heading to this new era, which I'm terming sort of the PAX data, where we're going to see every industry storing lots of data, improving itself. I talk to companies in railways, to ag companies, large equipment manufacturers, classic heavy industry, as well as retailers, telecom, you name it. It's really hard to find an industry that's not going through this transition right now of becoming data intensive. So just about every aspect of our lives is now being touched by this technology. While I've been talking, our phones have talked to lots of different Hadoop clusters probably out there in a variety of ways. So next slide. So we need to watch out for the bad stuff, and it feels like these days I watch science fiction movies and read science fiction books, and just about everything I see and read, the guys who collect the data are the bad guys. And it's kind of depressing when you're in the business of collecting data and building technology to collect data. We start to look like the Manhattan Project. And I don't want us to end up there. And so we need to figure out how we can make sure that we don't become the bad guys in the real future as we are in the imagined future. So next slide. There's a whole lot of benefit that can be had. There's this ability to see what we're doing is valuable, and I think I'm generally an optimist, and I think there are it's possible to prohibit the things we don't want to happen from happening. We don't need to become a surveillance society without any privacy, without preventing the good side. So let's look at, for example, a couple of potential goods that can come out of big data. Next slide, please. So first, it's education. I think we all recognize that around the world, education is a key to society improving for folks. If the more educated folks are, the better jobs they can get, and more of the kinds of jobs that we're going to have in future economies are going to require more education. So the degree we can improve education, we can improve society to a large degree. And data can help us here. There's a lot of evidence that kids don't all learn at the same rate, that they learn different parts of the curriculum at different rates, that one kid will learn one part fast and another part quickly. So the classic model of pacing everyone in lockstep is not a very efficient way to educate people. It's much better if you can have a custom experience for each student and help them to advance at their rate, and they'll all advance further in the same amount of time than they would otherwise. So these kind of observations are fed by data, and if we're going to start building systems to do this kind of pacing and to help interact, we need to study data about kids and how they're using educational tools. We've seen a lot in various data applications that the more data you can amass, the better you can make predictions and better understand what's going on. There's a wide variety of behavior out there, especially in areas like this. And with a larger sample of data, you can make more accurate predictions. But it's scary to collect data about kids. There was Microsoft had a nonprofit they recently funded. I guess it was not Microsoft. It was the Gates Foundation, I think, funded a thing called In Bloom. People hear about In Bloom? Maybe not. It was a neat effort to try to address this issue, but people didn't trust them, and they ended up shutting down. They were going to try to collect data and help research to improve education, and it's sad, and I hope we don't give up on this goal, because I think it's a really important one, and there's a lot of benefit to be had, and it'd be sad if we didn't do the right things to enable this kind of application. Next. Another big area, obviously, is we're all getting older. I know I am anyway. Is healthcare, and this at lots of different levels, both for countries like the U.S., but also in the third world. Medical research benefits greatly from data, and the more we can gather, the better job we can do taking care of people. I visited Children's Healthcare in Atlanta 6 months or so ago, and they had this amazing thing where a couple of guys just decided to start collecting the data from all of the sensors hooked up to babies in the neonatal ICU. So these are mostly preemies, really, really tiny babies who can't get along on their own, and they just had an idea. Hey, let's just start gathering this and look at it. They collected, instead of, earlier it was just wrapping and throwing away all the readings, and instead they were able to save weeks and months worth of data on. They just took 5 old PCs and hooked them together and sort of jury-rigged a cluster. And once they had it, the nurses started posing questions. It wasn't some big research initiative. It was just the nurses who were there taking care of the babies who wanted to look at the data. And they started, one of the things they looked at was the amount of stress that was induced in a kid when they did a heel prick to check blood. And they could quickly see that although the kids stopped crying in a couple minutes, their vitals on average didn't return to normal for oftentimes up to 30 minutes, their heart rate and their rate of breathing. And so they learned that the methods they were using were inducing a lot more stress than was healthy. And they worked to alter. They could see which cases were inducing less stress and try to understand how, what was happening then. And the nurses could improve their daily practice. So, relatively low tech in many ways. Just a couple of old PCs and a few people and the nurses doing it, but able to make a real difference in understanding and actually giving care. And so there's all kinds of possibilities here. But once again, an area where people rightfully fear abuse of such data. Next slide. Last example of a general area is climate change. Some people believe it's happening, some don't. Let's take for the sake of argument that the climate is changing and that it's something we need to worry about. In order to understand it and understand how to address it, data can play a huge role. For example, if one cause is use of a burning of hydrocarbons, and we're trying to reduce our energy consumption, then the best way to reduce it is to monitor and understand how you're using it, or at least one good way to do that. And we're seeing that already. Power companies are deploying smart meters. They're gathering all the data. They're putting it into Hadoop clusters, and they're analyzing it, and they're coming up with incentive programs of various sorts to help people reduce their energy consumption. Another example that comes from climate is some people want to really control what data we collect and say there's certain kinds of data you can collect and certain you can't. And that's not necessarily a good approach. They started gathering CO2 data from the top of Mauna Kea, Mauna Loa, one of those the summits on the Big Island of Hawaii, in the 50s or 60s, not because they were trying to measure climate change. They were just trying to understand the annual cycle of CO2 change, which had been observed but hadn't been observed that reliably, and they really wanted to get some measurements from the cleanest air possible. And so they started doing that. And then once they had many years of the measurement, then they could actually see this general rise in CO2 levels over a longer period. So it was they discovered things for not the purpose of their original collection. And I think we see this a lot, that you don't know in advance what value data that you collect might have. And there's lots of long-term longitudinal health studies where they follow people and collect all kinds of information about them for 30 years, and then they, in the future, can use this to diagnose a host of diseases that they may not have even known existed when they started collecting the data. Next slide. So, how do we do this? I think it comes down to trust. If we're not going to limit the collection, then we need to have people trust the people who are collecting it. There's some opportunity for technological solutions. You can encrypt data. You can have good ACLs, good access controls. You can anonymize data sets. But these are all imperfect at some level. They inhibit abuse, but they don't stop it entirely alone. Anonymization has been shown again and again that it's hard to do in such a way that people can't defeat it in many cases and find out who the people are, and at least some of them. And the other problem is if you come up with an anonymization scheme that is really effective, it ends up muddying the data, blurring things so that you can't actually find the distinctions you were hoping to in the data because they've been anonymized away, in effect. So it isn't just a technical problem, and we need to build trust in institutions. So I'm going to list a few ways here, a few methods I think we can use to help build that trust. Things we can look to. I don't have the real answer. I'm not going to give you an answer today. Rather, I'm just trying to provoke some thoughts and give some general ideas. So next slide, please. The first thing I think that is key, that is a prerequisite to building trust, is transparency. If you're collecting data, you need to let people know you're collecting it. People don't like to find out later that you've got a bunch of stuff about them. That sort of surprise has proven unpleasant for the institutions who do the collection. We've seen a number of such backlashes. And if people know, and not only that you've collected the data, but what you're going to use it for, then and if you change what you're using it for, advertising that as soon as you have a new idea and say, now we're actually going to use it for this new purpose. Maybe originally we were gathering cell phone location data to figure out where to put new towers, but now we're using it to figure out traffic patterns and give driving directions. You're repurposing the data. You need to tell people now that's where we're using your location, and these are all the uses we're making of it. And that gives people the ability to object. They need to understand, and they need to believe you, which I think comes to some of the next things. So next. Another key element, I think, is establishing, next slide, please, establishing best practices, there we are, around data. So these are the things like the technical elements of encrypting things, of anonymizing things. I think a lot of it is very simple. Not showing people things that aren't germane to the task at hand in user interfaces, and really getting these standardizations, as well as standards for how you describe the transparency in an understandable way, and describe these different functions. I saw someone mention recently the idea that we should have badges like they do in garments, telling you the temperature you need to wash it and what kind of dryer that it goes in. There are these international symbols that tell us how to launder our clothing. We need some simple icons that people can use to say how your data is going to be used when you're clicking a button and filling a box. We need to develop these languages to communicate this stuff effectively. Next, please. Another element is we do need to draw clear lines that people can't step over. Some of these, are simply that, you can't, show people's home addresses, unless they, gave you explicit permission to do that. Some of these are fairly obvious. If we've made transparency is a policy, if people are saying they're doing one thing but they're doing another, that needs to be well defined. And it gives us a basis for the last element, which is enforcement. Next slide, please. We've got to have people who are checking up. And we can't all individually go and probe the institutions which are collecting our data and verify things. But somebody needs to verify things. And regulation can sound scary to a lot of people. But we've come to accept it in a lot of industries that we do trust, for the most part. If you look at stock markets, there's an organization called FINRA, which is not a governmental organization. It's run as a nonprofit, funded by all of the markets, to verify every trade that happens and look for any illegal patterns. They happen to be a Hadoop user and are getting a lot of value out of big data tools in helping to provide us with confidence that the markets are not being abused, that it's not a totally rigged game. I know there's going to be some naysayers who say, well, it's still a rigged game, but it's not totally. I mean, we probably all of us, or most of us, have some retirement funds in the markets and have some degree of confidence that they're well run, and it's because there are organizations that are monitoring. You think about classic professions of medicine. There's doctors need to be certified. They need to be re-examined. They're reviewed. There's a lot of regulation around medicine to make sure that you can trust when you go to a doctor that they're not going to take advantage of you. Lawyers, right, have the bar. And most of these cases, it's self-regulation. There's some government regulation, but it's the industries themselves have stepped in and established bodies that are independent of any one member of the industry to help to build trust in the whole industry. And I think we need to start thinking about that. As deployers of data systems, as members of these industries and as vendors to these industries, how do we help institutions establish that trust? Because without that, we're going to get laws imposed that are going to be counterproductive, that we're not going to like. We're going to get, I think, sort of reactions that aren't healthy and are going to inhibit a lot of these uses that we'd like to see. Next slide. It's not just an issue that we can resolve locally. It's got to be done globally. Online technologies aren't constrained by borders. Within the U.S., the FTC's been doing a lot of work in this area. I encourage you to look at some of their publications. They think a lot about data privacy, and they're out and they're prosecuting folks. I think their approach is very good. They generally look for areas where there is abuse. They're reactive in this way, but and then try to figure out what are the regulations we can use to ensure that these sorts of abuses don't happen again. And they're, for the most part, just finding existing laws that are violated by folks who are collecting data. They've done a lot of work recently on people who are doing discriminatory lending practices and trying to make sure that people using data don't encourage that. In Europe, they've got a big law that's in the process of being completed. The GDPR. I forget exactly what it stands for. One of the elements of that is this right to be forgotten. People here have been following that. Interesting case. Frightens a lot of people that it's an overreaction. For those who haven't followed it, it was a fellow in Spain who was in some financial duress, hadn't paid some loans, and this got documented in the newspaper. It's in the 90s maybe. The newspaper's online, the archives of the newspaper, and when you search for his name on Google, it brings up this information. He wishes it wasn't there, and he was able to sue Google and get Google to take it down, and moreover set the precedent that if there's information about people that is true, but no longer deemed that relevant, which is a hard thing to define, then they can request it be taken down. And that frightens a lot of people that it's a censorship, permits people to request anything about them to be taken down because it wasn't false, and the newspaper didn't have to take it down. Google just needed to remove it from the search results. So sort of odd. On the other hand, we've had similar related laws for a long time in that your financial history from more than a certain time back, 7 years or so, can't be used for tax evasion and various purposes. You've got this sort of statute of limitations on data that is relevant for those purposes. And arguably Google is sort of the new record keeper. So it's not a perfect analogy, but it is a related phenomenon, and we're going to see how this works out, and then how the legal regime that ends up in Europe ends up impacting what we do here in the States. So I encourage you to all stay tuned to that. Next slide, please. I just want to close with sort of a plea. As I've already mentioned, I think it's all of our responsibility to think about these things and to think about the big picture of where we're headed. I run into people all the time who tell me they keep their email at one service and their calendar on another because they don't want anybody to correlate the two and figure things out about them. And they're making their lives harder because they don't trust their providers. And that saddens me. And I hope we can try to think about what would it take for you to trust folks, and what can we do as professionals in this industry to help build that trust and to try to get to that point where we don't have to wear tinfoil hats as we read our email. So that's all I have. Happy to talk about this stuff further in questions if we have time. Next slide. Sorry, last slide. Anything else? Any other questions you have for me about other things that I've worked on? But thanks.
We'll take one or two questions. Anyone have a question? Andy don't get this opportunity very often. Pose a question. So one or two. Any questions? Okay.
Scared them all off. Makes it easy. Oh, we got one. All right.
What do we do about the implications of collecting data? For example, they collect healthcare data, but eventually 5 years, 10 years down the line, they say, okay, fine, now we know that you've been smoking for 10 years, your healthcare premium goes up. Or we know that this happened to you 5 years ago. That time we didn't care, you didn't care, we collected the data, but now here is the use of that data, you pay more. So how do we prevent those kind of things from happening? Because that is one thing that would really build the trust for people to allow them to collect the data.
Yeah, so how can you keep people from abusing the data later? I mean, I think there's the scenario you painted of people finding out from data that you smoked and charging you larger healthcare premiums it'd be definitely be a bad thing for you. I think it's a bad thing for society, and that if you stop, if somebody can no longer afford healthcare, then they're going to end up costing society more than if they could continue to have affordable healthcare, likely. So it's probably not a good program. But I think there's the key thing is that needs to be done transparently, and then people need to protest, and there needs to be policies to say that's illegal. That healthcare needs to be blind to that kind of data. I think not gathering the data up front is a short-sighted way to manage that. I think it's much better in some ways it might be hard to prevent the people from making those sorts of inferences long term. Rather, what you want to do is say that that's not a fair thing to do, to charge people more for that kind of pre-existing condition. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about standardizing this approach. Is Apache Foundation working towards something that we could maybe revolution that we could be part of?
Question is Apache working on anything for standardizing this kind of stuff? Well, I mean, Apache doesn't work on anything because Apache doesn't have an agenda. We work on whatever people come to Apache want to work on. And so my hope is that there'll be some projects that build technologies to help with this. Certainly all the work that's being done on various security projects is relevant. Helps you to build the tools that can enforce these sort of best practices and not make abuse too easy. You don't want to tempt people. And I imagine there'd be cases for, there's some clever advanced anonymization methods, which I haven't seen any of those implemented at Apache, but those would be useful to have as well. But again, Apache needs people to contribute before it does anything. All right, we out of time? Oh, thank you.